Hi, folks who are joining. Just a note to say we will start in just about a minute to let a few more folks join our audience. But we look forward to our discussion. And please note you can place your questions in the chat and we will try and answer them at the end. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So for those of you who have been here the whole time, here's my third introduction. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining us here today for Freedom of the Press Foundation's event on using public records to fight government secrecy and improve communities. My name is Lauren Harper. I am FPF's first Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy, and I'll just go ahead and get us started. So most of us, and perhaps some of you know, that filing FOIA requests and following up until you get a response is an act of love, or perhaps it's a bit of an obsession or a hint of stubbornness on the requester's part, perhaps all of the above. And most of us also know that even in the best of times, the government keeps too much information secret. Now, some of this is deliberate and some of this is a result of bureaucratic inertia, but I think it's fair to say that we are not in normal times. In addition to the more routine bottlenecks, we're also facing a new anti-transparency landscape. Federal Freedom of Information Act offices are being closed, information is disappearing from agency websites, agencies are no longer creating records in certain instances, and there are reports that agencies are inappropriately destroying records. Now, that's just all at the national level. At the local level, we're seeing legislation introduced across various states, including some that would make it easier for local governments to ignore requests that they don't like. So today, we're going to talk with three experts about how government secrecy damages communities from Washington, D.C. to small towns across the country. We're also going to talk about how records requests inform the public about critical information at every level of government and can help repair the damage that secrecy causes. Finally, we'll discuss practical tips for crafting the most effective FOIA request possible. So that's about enough for me. I'm going to take a quick minute to introduce our panelists. So I'll start off with Nate Jones. Nate is the FOIA director at the Washington Post, where he works with reporters to target local, state, and federal records to request, appeal, and sue for. Prior to the Post, he was the director of the FOIA project for the National Security Archive, where, among other things, he was the first person to actually introduce me to FOIA many, many years ago, and basically passed on his obsession with FOIA to me, and I'm sure countless others. He's also used FOIA to write a book on the 1983 Able Archer nuclear war scare and has served 2 terms on the Federal FOIA Advisory Committee. Thanks for being here, Nate. We've also got Miranda Spivack. She is a veteran reporter and editor who specializes in stories about government accountability and secrecy, urban development, and immigration. She spent 20 years as an editor and reporter for the Washington Post as an editor on the Metro desk, and her series State Secrets for RevealNews.org formed the basis of her new book called Backroom Deals in Our Backyard, which is out now and explores underreported secret rise in state and local secrecy. Last but not least, we've got Michael Morisy. Thank you, Nate. Thank you. We've also got Michael Morisy, who is the CEO and co-founder of MuckRock, which helps the public file FOIA requests. To date, more than 156,000 FOIA requests have been filed through MuckRock to all levels of government, resulting in the release of nearly 11 million pages of records. Mike has led hundreds of trainings on transparency, investigative journalism, civic engagement, and has also served 2 terms on the FOIA Federal Advisory Committee. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate your time today. I'm going to jump into questions. I'll start off by asking a few, but audience members, as I mentioned at the beginning, please know that you can ask questions using the Q&A feature in the chat, and we will answer audience questions at the end. Panelists, I also encourage you to pose questions and ask some of your other panelists if you've got them. So for the first question, I kind of just want to set the stage a little bit and help our audience get to know you all a little bit. So what got you interested in filing public records requests, and why do you think these requests are such an important tool for journalists? Just to get us started, Miranda, let's start with you.
Okay, thanks for having me. So why did I start filing public records requests? Because as a journalist, I was hitting information blockades all at the state and local level, which is where most of my work was being done. And it was for stuff that clearly was a matter of public record, such as an outside contract that a government has. You might want to find out if the mayor's brother-in-law was getting the contract, for instance. Um, there were other very fundamental things like the documents that back up a decision to make a budget request. How did they get to that point? Those documents should be public. Just a whole variety of things. And this was actually in one particular county when I was at the Post, Prince George's, but I cannot say that the other counties around the DMV, as we call it, the District, Maryland, and Virginia, are particularly forthcoming. Some are a little bit better than others. A lot of this information should be posted online. I shouldn't even have to do a public records request. That's a whole nother issue for local governments who are often underfunded. And so digitizing their work is tougher for them than maybe at the national level. But, I was looking for what I thought was fundamental information that not only I, as a journalist, but any member of the community who's voting or concerned about budgeting or any of those matters, they should be able to get it too. And that's eventually led me to write about those people. But that's sort of, I was just looking for the basics.
Nate, do you want to tell us what got you into FOIA?
Yeah, sure. Miranda's great book talks a lot about accidental activists, and I was, I guess, a little bit of an accidental archivist activist. When I was in college, I was researching this thing called Able Archer 83, which was a near nuclear war scare in 1983 that was a bit of a mystery, but seemed like it could have been dangerous. And while I was doing this research, I kind of paid on my own dime to go to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. And how it works is you ask for the box, and this box said military exercises, and then there was a folder about Able Archer 83. And what that was a nuclear war preparation that the Soviets reacted to, and it was pretty dangerous. But anyways, I pull out the folder and open it up, and it says classified, and then my heart sinks. And I go to the archivist and say, "Oh no, how can I ever see this?" And he said, "Well, you can do FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, but good luck." So instead of giving up, I kind of got a little angry, as Lauren mentioned, and I started researching FOIA, which took me to the National Security Archive at George Washington University, where Lauren and I worked, which is, I think, one of the best FOIA requesters in the world. They do mostly for important historic records. But I studied their website and it was so cool. I begged and became an intern there. Worked there for 10 years before at the Post, more than 10 years. So the joke is, if the dang Reagan Library, and I did get the documents, I did write a book with the documents, but if the dang Reagan Library had just given me the records right away, I wouldn't have helped file tens of thousands of more public records requests.
Well, then I guess I'm kind of glad that you didn't get that record on at first pass. Mike, what about you?
Yeah. So as a bit of background, in the late 80s, President George H.W. Bush was joking around after a military misadventure where a number of U.S. service members were killed. And this was broadcast on television. And so, like government always does, when something embarrassing gets out, they passed a rule or a law that barred the press from looking at that issue again. And so for about 13 years, the press was barred from being present when deceased returning service members came back to the U.S. at Dover Air Force Base. And that held for 13 years. And then I was reading Time magazine in 2004, and somebody had used the Freedom of Information Act to get copies of all the Air Force's photos of all the coffins returning from overseas. And they published these photos on a website. This was Russ Kick, who recently passed away. And this was the first time I'd heard of the Freedom of Information Act, or at least I remember hearing about the Freedom of Information Act. And there was this one person who ran this almost anonymous website on the internet. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't, particularly an activist. He called himself a citizen archivist. But he was able to kind of stand up and put this really powerful lens back on the most powerful military in the world through the Freedom of Information Act. And I got really fascinated by this power of transparency not just for journalists, but for anybody to kind of ask hard questions of the government and actually force the government to answer. And it doesn't always turn out that way, doesn't always have victories, but I think I just became really enamored with this idea that here's this law that kind of reminds the government that it's the people in charge, and it's a really amazing mechanism when it works to bring that into life. And so uh, ever since reading that article, I got really interested in public records and primary source materials, and then uh, somehow decided to devote the rest of my career to that.
That's so well put. I remember the archive had a framed picture of the cover of the paper with the pictures of the returning caskets coming back to Dover, and photos can be especially powerful. I'd like to start by diving into questions specifically about state and local secrecy. Hopefully, after that, we'll be able to focus on some federal FOIA issues. But Miranda, especially since your new book is out, I'd like to start with you. We've already got a question in the chat that kind of hints at this. But the Trump administration is attacking federal FOIA offices. It's gotten a lot of media attention, and rightly so. For example, the entire CDC FOIA office was placed on administrative leave. A lot of others have seen large-scale reductions. And I think it's fairly safe to assume that federal FOIA offices are good targets for ongoing reductions in force. We've also got long-standing problems with the federal FOIA. So I'm wondering if you could suggest some ways or provide some examples where state and local FOI laws could kind of fill the federal gaps.
Yeah, it's obviously a huge problem now that we are confronting at the federal level, which of course does ripple to the states and localities. But one of the things that could happen, especially if there was a coordinated effort by somebody like MuckRock or someone else, is that a lot of the material that goes to the CDC, for example, are state health reports, state by state, that are then compiled, analyzed, whatever. So if there was a way to coordinate that data, it still exists at the state level and it should still be available at the state level. Same with the Department of Education. A lot of the school statistics and test scores and all of that gets fed from the states to the feds, where again, it gets put together in a very used to be cohesive fashion that was somewhat usable to users. But you know, that important material still exists, but it's going to have to be captured. So, you know, it's not a great solution. Obviously, what's happening at the federal level is a disaster, I think, for history, for, you know, accountability, for transparency, but there are still some solutions right now anyway. And then there is also a group I know at Harvard, maybe Mike or Nate knows more about this than I do, that is trying to scrape and archive these websites before the material has gone away. But you know, the idea that there is a press secretary for the Trump administration who stands up and uses the word transparency all the time, it's just beyond ironic.
Yeah. And I believe the group you're referring to at Harvard is at the End of Term Archive. Is that correct? Okay. Yes, they also do.
So,
Yeah, they do terrific work. I'd like to pose this next question to Mike. It's a little bit related, but Mike, you've done a whole lot of trainings in your time. You've also provided a platform in MuckRock that's enabled tens of thousands of requests to be filed. I was looking at the MuckRock dashboard, and it said that requests filed through MuckRock have gone to 26,000 agencies, most of which are state and local entities. So I'm wondering, with the perspective of, you know, the bird's eye view that you kind of have with this, are there certain kinds of state and local records that are especially difficult to obtain? And are there tips that you can offer our listeners for filing more effective requests to get them?
Yeah, I found there's roughly three categories, and you could come up with a lot more categories, but three broad categories I would say are more challenging than others. I would say anything to do with policing and security, particularly national security, which I've seen applied to parking tickets in the past, so that can be a very broad brush. Commercial interests, which Miranda's book covers in just really compelling detail, but then also confusing or vague requests. And I think this is one of the areas where there's a lot of misalignment between agencies and the public, right? I think we're used to Google, where we can kind of type in a topic and get good results back, or at least we used to a few years ago. With public records, a lot of times it's shocking, particularly at the state and local level, how paper-based these records are, how many different information systems agencies have. And so we might go and say, hey, we know the agency is up to this. I want records about that. And then the public records officer processing your request has no idea how to actually conduct that search. They're not sure which office within their department you want them to look through. And so I think doing some research and kind of figuring out, okay, what records do I know exist, or who might have these records, and trying to figure out, one of the things I always tell people during trainings is sort of try to step into the mindset of a bureaucrat and imagine, where are the records that you care about? How would you describe them? How would they work? Who would have access to them? And then use that to kind of really guide that public records officer to exactly what you want. I've spent a lot of time at FOIA officer conferences. One of the requests that they hate the most is, I want any and all documents about X. And that seems like a very good request to most people, right? If you're just like Googling, that's how you Google. But I think if you're filing a public records request, they want you to figure out what are the specific records or data that you're looking for, so that they can be explicit. It's kind of like a hyperliteral sort of thing. And so I think getting your request from being very vague and broad, even if it doesn't feel that way to you, even if it's a big news issue, just put yourself in the mind of sort of who's working at that government agency, and take it from there.
Can I also add to that, that if you can contact that FOIA officer first and discuss how they keep records and what they have, sometimes they will be very helpful in helping you frame your request.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, sometimes it's difficult not to ask for vague at the beginning. So something that I try and do when I have no other choices, please contact me. I'm happy to narrow this if you can kind of help me figure out how to do that. Mike, I did have a quick follow-up. I've always been a little curious kind of what prompted you to co-found MuckRock initially. And I'm also curious how the platform has adapted over the years as agencies continually tweak their submission guidelines. For example, I'm thinking of more federal agencies adopting portals and things like that. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, we started actually looking at sort of a problem, which was sort of local news was facing real challenges. We started in 2010. I guess we started that work in 2009. And we felt that the media industry was about to kind of go into a tailspin, and that is unfortunately proven true, even worse than probably we could have imagined at that point. And we were curious sort of what kind of can be done to kind of fill a lot of these major gaps being left. And so we went back and we actually read through a lot of investigative journalism and a lot of accountability projects over the years that led to laws being changed, that led to people being fired, that led to real change. And one of the common threads we found is public records, right? I think if you have evidence, if you have documents to back stuff up, that oftentimes really increases the impact versus just interviewing people or just talking, having a compelling story. If you can back up that compelling personal narrative with actual documents or actual data, it's much, much more powerful. And every community in the United States, by and large, is covered by a public records law. So we wanted to, make it easier for journalists to file more public records requests. How can we take that tedium away? And back when we were starting, we were actually having to like walk over requests to government agencies. We were faxing requests to government agencies. We were mailing requests to agencies. It was a very manual, physical process, even in 2010. And what we wanted to do was kind of, hey, if you're sitting at a public meeting, you hear somebody mention a record, let you fire it off from your phone. And so that's what we built to try to, make it easier for journalists to use public records more, but also non-journalists. I think one thing is there's a lot of people out there who know a lot more about government, certainly than I do. And so if we can enable them to publicly file requests and get answer to these really important questions that they have, that's something that can help inform the entirety of the public. And we kind of built it not knowing if it would work. I'd actually only filed 3 public records myself when we started, and all 3 of them had ended in failure. So it wasn't a promising start, but we early on very quickly found people asked for had great ideas for requests, and being able to post those publicly kind of pressured agencies to comply. And since then, I think, as you mentioned, agencies, FOIA portals did not exist when we started. Now they're very common. And so we've continued to adapt our technology to kind of interface with different government agencies, the ways that they want to receive requests. But also, how do you continue to invite more people into the process? So we now do a lot of crowdsourcing projects. So maybe that's gathering data so we help inform filing records requests. We're working on a project right now where we're looking at um, police officers who had disciplinary complaints against them. And so maybe you don't want to directly file a request, but you can help us go through some data, and then we'll file a request around this issue based on crowdsourced information that we're gathering. And so what do we do to kind of bring more people into the process and kind of broaden the transparency tent?
That's great. Well, I can't talk about faxing FOIA requests and not think about my time with Nate and sending faxes to the CIA. So I'm going to turn this next question to Nate. While you've been at the Post, you've helped a number of stories using local FOIA requests, including a recent one that I really thought was fascinating, exposing the District of Columbia's problems with the juvenile justice system. I think that these requests were sent to the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services in particular. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how much work goes into the research before filing those requests, or for any other local FOI story you've worked on with the Post, and how these documents were released.
Yeah. Thanks, Lauren. I remember faxing lots of requests with you. So there's a smart Mike Walker at the New York Times, great FOIA requester. He said, and I've stolen from him, do your research on the front end before filing the FOIA. So like Mike said earlier, you want to put yourself in the chair of the government official that gets the record, down to the email account or the filing cabinet or the name on top of the form. That's your job as a requester, if you want to be an effective requester, to do that on the front end. So we definitely did lots of that, Lauren. One strategy that I want to mention that works really well that we used in this series is the strategy of, I guess I like to call it replication. So in this case, we went to all of the reading rooms, which are just websites of the DC youth agencies, and saw all of the records that they had released. And there's a couple cases where kind of like one-off, like interesting records were released. So we said, aha, if they release this one time, they have to release this 100 times. Or that's the argument we made. And we said, please release, hypothetically, please release form 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Please note, here is a link on your website where you previously released it. Please release all of these forms that you have filled out in the past 5 years. That is a great FOIA strategy. One more thing I want to mention that we didn't do in this project, but Post reporters often do, is they go to MuckRock.com and click requests and click the agency they're looking at, and then they can click all successful requests, and then they can replicate from those that others have done. So what we did in this project, Lauren, and what is often a very good strategy is replication. Don't reinvent the wheel. Have an agency release more of what they already have released.
I've definitely gone to MuckRock and looked at the successful request and used that strategy. It is a very good one. So thank you for sharing that. So this next question that I've got is for Miranda, whose new book is out. And it talks about the harm that secrecy causes and provides some specific examples on how it hurts communities. But the thing that I was struck by with this book is its very first example, timely enough, is about how Andrew Cuomo was hiding data about the spread of COVID in nursing homes across New York City. Now, today, of course, is the New York City mayoral primary. Cuomo's on the ballot again. So not only does this go to show that, FOIA can continue to provide headlines long after you get the release, but Miranda, I'm wondering, did New York City learn anything from the exposure of the COVID secrecy or not? Were any actions taken to mitigate it after that story broke? Basically, what more can you tell us about it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It was actually statewide in New York that Cuomo was hiding the ball on nursing homes, not just in the city. And I'm not sure that New York has done much to be much more transparent since that time. I think the most disturbing thing about that was the way Cuomo had presented himself, which was he was on these daily press conferences where he was really oozing warmth and seemingly very transparent and talking about numbers of COVID infections in the state, et cetera, et cetera. But then it turned out over here on the left hand or on the right hand, however you want to put it, they were hiding the information about how severe the problems were in the nursing homes and why they had become severe, because some people, Cuomo was letting, or the state was letting people back into these nursing homes even when they were infected. So there was a whole sort of series of reasons and mismanagement. And then they sort of hid the data. And so, I can't say, I mean, one of the examples in my book is a small community in upstate New York, which has poisoned drinking water. They endured huge problems actually before COVID about how severely poisoned their drinking water was. And again, the state was very slow to be transparent about it, even though they had a lot of information. So, lessons learned, one could only hope, but I don't have any good examples, at least not out of New York State, for that. And it is, it's been fascinating to me that Cuomo is back in the fray, not only because he had these sexual harassment cases against him, but also, which he's now sort of dismissed as not an issue, but also because there was a lot of lack of transparency during COVID, despite the appearance of being forthcoming.
Yeah, your mention of the poison drinking water, of course, reminds me of the Flint, Michigan water story. And I just want to underscore that for that story to break, it required federal FOIA requests to the EPA, but also to Michigan and I think some local entities, which really goes back to if you're digging, there are oftentimes scenarios where you're going to have to triangulate your request to a bunch of different entities. This question is for all panelists. I'm curious, especially because I focus primarily on federal FOIA issues, but do we have a sense of what this state and local compliance with FOIA laws is across the country, and if there are any trends about whether or not they're getting better or worse? So I'm curious, Mike, Miranda, or Nate, what do you guys think about this? What have you observed?
Worse.
Worse.
I mean, there's a study, Dave Coulier actually at Florida did a study of MuckRock's data, used MuckRock's data to look at the compliance rate and said it was getting worse over the last 10 years.
Yeah, go ahead, Nate.
I think I agree that in general it's getting worse. But it points to a broader issue. The issue is that anti-secrecy advocates are always playing defensive, and pro-secrecy advocates are always playing offense. As Miranda puts out in their book, that can be business interests that don't want their so-called commercial secrets released by state laws that often write the legislation that helps them. Or even charter schools that want more school secrecy, so their cause, charter schools, can operate easily without less secrecy, and they write the laws. What I don't see very much of, very unfortunately, is pro-secrecy people writing the legislation, advocating, giving awards to every state lawmaker that's a champion for secrecy, or even newspapers do a very bad job advocating for the laws they need to do their work, in my opinion. So I think part of the reason that in local levels and federal levels things are getting worse is because there is a very strong advocacy, lobbying, informing group for pro-secrecy that tells the legislators exactly what they want to do and rewards them with that monetarily often, and there's not on the other side. And maybe it's always going to be unfair, but I do think that pro-secrecy advocates probably need to do more than just file requests. They need to get legislatures to pay attention to their constituents, the people, and make sure that they have access to the information they need.
One of the issues with that, though, and this is sort of what I found in researching my book, is that there isn't a constituency for transparency at the local and state level until somebody bumps into a problem and then realizes there's a problem. And so that, I mean, there are a lot of groups at the state and local level that are pro-transparency, but I think they really have to get into communities and have to translate for people why it matters, not even when you need it, but before you need it, why it should matter that your government should be more transparent.
Nate had a really interesting point that I'd love to follow up on, especially with a group of journalists. And I'm wondering, Nate, if you care to speak on this or anyone else, why is it, do you think, that papers are reluctant to endorse FOIA reform or promote more pro-secrecy or pro-transparency measures, or even have something like a secrecy news beat, stuff like that? Is there a reason that you can identify that makes papers, big or small, reluctant to do this?
Um, well, speaking generally, I'm gonna be a little careful. I will note that the Post does have a column called "Revealing Records" that I write. That's a bit of a secrecy news beat. I welcome 1,000 more of those and more posts even. Um, so I think that that's on. Are there journalists that are eager to write about it and are readers willing to click about it and pay for subscriptions? So that's the answer to that. On the advocacy part, it's complicated. Speaking just generally, papers are very loath to look like they're advocating for anything except maybe the First Amendment writ broadly. And I don't know exactly why it is. I think you got to have some higher ups in the Post on to explain that. But it's not just, it's that many newspapers, just the idea of advocating for laws that they need, they're generally not willing to do. And that's not to say that there's not great folks at Freedom of Press Foundation, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, NFOIC, others that do it. I just want more.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one of the things that I am always struck by, but probably don't say out loud enough, is that a successful, FOIA regime, whether it's at the state or the local level or the federal level, can't really exist without a successful, and vibrant reporting community. And the role of the media landscape and those media watchdogs is also super important. Miranda talks a bit about that in her book as well. I wanted to move on because we've touched on this a little bit at a couple points. But this question is for all panelists, since I think you've all mentioned it, but what role do private companies play in government secrecy? We've talked a little bit about trade secret exemptions, but there's also the issue of more public work is being increasingly done by private companies. So I'd love if folks could talk a little bit about that, as well as talk about, is it ever valid for the government to say, yes, there's this trade secret exemption, we have to invoke it? And if not, what are effective ways to fight these exemptions? So that question is for all of you.
I'll start. I mean, trade secrets, as Nate and Mike mentioned, do play a big role in my book, and also in the number of denials around the country, especially, really across the board, I think federal, state, and local. And one of the issues that I found is that state and local governments in particular, but I think this also actually applies at the federal level, they're not really equipped to evaluate what is a trade secret. So if a company, and this has to do with a lot of functions being outsourced, which also has been in the increase over the years, a company says, no, we don't want you to tell the public what we're paying our employees who are doing government work, even though we got the contract because we said we would pay them a fair wage, which is one of the examples in the book. But then, and then the government sort of says, we don't know what to do. And they often defer to the company who says this is a trade secret. So there's really no independent evaluation. And it's a hugely used exemption. And the other thing, of course, and this is sort of maybe adjacent to your question, is that a lot of the public records requests do not come from journalists and from non-journalists and non-lawyers. They come from businesses looking for business information about other businesses. And they, I would argue, have clogged up the works quite a bit. But see what Mike and Nate.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've seen a hollowing out of sort of government competence and sort of a deference to corporate interests. I think one of the things, building on sort of something Nate was saying, is I think there are a lot of constituencies for transparency, but they are very divided, right? You look at all these businesses that are built on public weather data, that are built on public records in the form of Zillow and other companies that use public records to kind of come up with house prices and real estate data. There's tons and tons of uses of public records. I've never seen those organizations and news organizations and press associations and immigrant rights groups that also rely heavily on public records kind of come together in a consolidated way. And so I think they're all fighting sort of these individual battles, and in all those individual battles, I think they're losing, which I think is a big problem.
Yeah. So completely agree with my co-panelists. I'll just mention for the viewers to think about, since we're mentioning corporate interests and public records, um, and if you file hundreds or thousands of requests like we do, you'll see pretty soon that there is a big tilt from the agencies processing them themselves and private corporations processing the records. I recommend that you take a look at Jason Leopold's piece from a couple weeks ago about Opexis, which used to be another company that I'm spacing the name of that everyone knew. But they are processing more and more and more FOIA requests. And I think we have to ask the question, are they helping release more people to more records to more people more quickly, or are they helping to withhold more records and slow down the process? And it's hard to do because they're a private company. If the government was doing it, the government could go and testify, be called to testify, and FOIA processors would say, this is what we're doing. But now they would say, well, we have contracted this out to Opexis, and there are other companies too that do mostly local. And you have to wonder what is going on, because a lot of times the problems I see with my requests are done by the company, are caused by the companies that local agencies and federal agencies contract out. So it's a problem on many fronts, not just claiming confidential information, but being paid to do FOIA processing for agencies.
I think that's such a good point, and it's a segue to my next question. And just to let listeners know, I'm going to ask one or two more questions on state and local FOIA stuff, then we're going to transition at the tail end to the Fed, which certainly deserves attention. But Nate brought up, the role of third parties and tech in responding to FOIA requests. And that gets me to a trend that I've noticed with local entities, including states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, have been introducing legislation to limit burdensome requesters. Now, this could include requesters who send a lot of requests. In some instances, it could also be perceived to be the ability to limit requests from requesters that the entity just doesn't like or deems harassment. So, can states ever have valid reasons for trying to limit requests, and how should they go about striking a balance between the public's right to know and what we know to be a situation of probably limited resources among these state and local entities? Anybody is welcome to jump in.
Sure. I think that while I can understand a potentially honestly burdensome, vexatious requester, I think is the term. I remember talking with my old boss at the National Security Archive. He said, Nate, you better be careful, because I can list right now about 24 agencies that would love nothing more than deem us a vexatious requester. And we filed thousands of requests, but we also showed what actually happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, what happened early in Able Archer, what happened during environmental summits. So my warning would be the cure of eliminating lots of requesters might be worse than the disease of the work of processing too many requests or perhaps harassment. There are probably other tools that states can use. I'll just make one more point that I think should be said. Certainly not always, but it's worth notable that part of the reason the state and local laws don't work often is because the processors in the federal, state, and local agencies don't want them to work. It's very important to write a good request that a person sitting in the chair that gets the request knows where to search for it, where to get the record, where to get it out. But as we mentioned before, if the request isn't perfect, there's nothing that an agency likes to do more, and it might be lack of resources, or it might be lack of zeal for giving the public their records. There's nothing an agency likes to do more than say, aha, I can close out this request without doing the work. And that's a warning sign to requesters to make sure that your requests are written almost perfectly so that can't happen. But that's also why I come at the angle of, let's not just allow another tool to say, aha, we're not doing the work for so-called vexatious requesters. If anything, we should be making the agencies reject fewer requests, contact the requesters, clarify, and process more records, give more records to the public. Thanks.
And I don't know that this is a solution at all, but really agencies already deal with what they think are vexatious requests by putting in outrageous fees that, you know, make it impossible to move forward, number one. And number two, they just, I think there's a First Amendment issue if you're going to start to clamp down on a written request. I mean, on what basis can you say no to this person when you have a state open records law, as they all do?
Just pushing back a little bit on what Nate said, I in my experience, the vast majority of FOIA officers at the federal, state, and local level do really care about the work that they're doing, and they are trying to kind of balance a lot of competing interests. I would say that they sometimes view things very differently than journalists because they, you know, are balancing different things than journalists are balancing. I think that's understandable. But I think one of the big challenges is that they are almost all universally, even a year ago, they were underfunded, and now they are much more underfunded. And they are kind of at the end of the process with very little kind of sway in terms of sort of how is this data stored, who has access to it. They're kind of reliant on so many outside factors that I think we really set our transparency processes up to fail. And you can see that's things are structured differently in other countries in terms of sort of how meaningful those laws are, and also just sort of how modernized their bureaucracies are. And so I think these are solvable problems, but I think it requires a lot of political will to overcome.
That's a good point. As a way to kind of transition, talking about state and local stuff to federal stuff, I'm curious if there are ever instances where any of you have seen state and local FOI laws shine and perhaps outperform the federal government, and talk a bit about why this might be happening and where you've seen perhaps state and local laws work better than the federal Freedom of Information Act.
You know, in Alabama, which is not exactly the most transparent state in the union, again, this was an example in the book, and it was an environmental issue. And sometimes the community, which was struggling hard to get information about a sewer system, sometimes they were getting better information from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management than they were from the US Department of Agriculture, which was one of the funders, or EPA. And this sort of goes to the triangulation issue, Lauren, that you mentioned at the outset, which is, you know, try knocking on different doors, because usually more than one agency has the information. I can't say that ADEM, as it's called, is actually a paragon of transparency. They are not. But in some instances, they did cough up information that they, you know, couldn't get from the feds. And it was about the federal state relationship or something where they'd worked on it together. So they both had information.
I just want to say, I take Mike's point, and let me reiterate, the vast majority of public records professionals I met do care deeply. But there are just some inefficiencies that are so inefficient that it's very hard to explain away. It's not due to money. If the agencies are so strapped, I'm talking about federal agencies, and I'll go back to your question, Lauren, why are they spending their resources to review records for exemptions that are not legally required to be reviewed for? So the exemption 5 pre-deliberative, that's a not a required exemption, that's an optional exemption. So the agencies are spending lots of resources to review stuff that should be released anyways, and no one inside the agency is saying, hey, let's not do this. So I want to make that point. I would be even more of an advocate for FOIA workers if agencies started doing stuff like that and using their very limited resources better. To your point, your question, Lauren, I tell my colleagues at the Post, absolutely file with state and federal agencies. One example, border data on the U.S.-Texas border, we filed with DHS and their components, and I think we're still waiting. We filed with Texas and got the records within days. So it's a great strategy to always file with as many agencies as you can. Of course, some agencies would say that's being vexatious, but it's still a good strategy. And more often than not, state agencies will be quicker than federal agencies. And I will just note that there are, depending on how you count, some 450 federal components that have a FOIA office. And many of those are still working, and many of those are still working pretty fast. Not the big ones that we think of like State Department, FBI, but go down the list and go to MuckRock and look at the smaller federal agencies, and often those will get you the records within 20 days too, if they have what you're looking for, knock on wood.
That's such a good point. I'm going to move on to federal stuff, but I want to acknowledge a question that was put in the Q&A feature, which a reminder, audience, please feel free to do that, from Alex Howard, who we all know. And he, reiterates that this is an extremely difficult is probably an understatement, but difficult time for the federal FOIA landscape. And it's not difficult just because of what's happening with federal FOIA offices. We're also seeing a crisis in records management issues, especially with what's going on at the National Archives, which has seen recently a budget proposal that will cut its budget by about 12%. This calls into question whether or not there's going to be anybody who's taken seriously when agencies inappropriately destroy records. So that's an issue that is underneath what we're also dealing with FOIA stuff, including the firing of FOIA offices wholesale. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you all is it possible? Is there a way that you could envision kind of maybe imagining FOIA offices to make them more insulated from political influence or firings? This is something that's come up when comparing the US FOIA to other countries, particularly Mexico's, which is, ends in kind of a sad story. But I'm wondering if there are techniques or ways that we could insulate FOIA offices from political pressure, political influence, if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I think that FOIA officers should be viewed within the government, similar to another office that was created around the same time as kind of the openist revolution, which is the IG's office. IGs are feared in their agency. FOIA officers are joked about. They say, we'll send you to work in Siberia, the FOIA office. If you dig deep, the public records officers get a FOIA request at the federal level and ask the program office to send me the records. That's where most of the delays come. The program officers just ignore them for years. So if you want to call it insulation, that would be fine. But I would rather call it empowerment and make it look similar to the IG's office that can order the people in the agency to release the things to the public in a timely manner.
Of course, we just saw the wholesale firing of a bunch of IGs, which, it's going to take a different makeup, I think, in Congress right now you're right. It would be a great idea to insulate the FOIA officers and give them some gravitas and respect, but I don't see it happening right now anyway.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's almost an unfair question to ask the FOIA and the open government community, because there are plenty of other constituencies who are also trying to figure out kind of how to push back against what's going on in the federal government right now. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of how to make FOIA more effective and even just raising its profile among Congress is, as a member of the transparency and open government community, we're really used to working with the congressional committees that oversee FOIA. So, for example, Judiciary in the Senate and Oversight in the House. But because FOIA has an impact on every federal policy issue, whether it's environmental, energy, any kind of domestic issue, health issue, it impacts in some ways every constituency group. And there are a lot of, for example, energy or environmental groups that do have large policy and advocacy campaigns and teams who have a lot of connections with different committees that don't explicitly look at FOIA, but there's nothing that stops those other communities who use FOIA sometimes from raising the profile of FOIA with those members of Congress, and hopefully kind of raising the FOIA awareness kind of across the board. But basically, yeah, I think we all need to be a little bit more creative in how we approach FOIA legislative solutions. But I was actually, Nate, I was thinking back to our time at the National Security Archive, where we worked a lot with, intelligence records, foreign policy records. And I think, I want to underscore something that you mentioned, which is that even though we're in this really dangerous time, I'd say, for our right to know, FOIA can still be successful. Sometimes that requires dedication, sometimes that requires luck. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you approach FOIA for, issues that are very, very sensitive, maybe even the nuclear war scare. But how can you manage to convince the government to release these kinds of documents, even in this environment? What tips would you offer folks?
Sure. I'm positive FOIA, by the way. Let me tell you, I got 3 emails this morning of FOIA releases, some of them by agencies under siege, and more yesterday. And that's federal FOIA, and the states are pouring in too. So one is be a proactive requester, not a reactive requester. If you plant your acorns, the trees will grow. They might not grow as your reporter right when you want them to, but if you're proactively filing 1 or 2 or 3 requests a day, you'll get back 1 or 2 or 3 good documents a week. That's a story. On sensitive stuff, you should just know the law and say, this has previously been spoken about in open hearings in the Senate, for example. That's harder to classify. And then my last point is, Miranda makes this in her book too. Don't be afraid to sue. I know it's like scary, but if you are fighting for something that's really important, it's not necessarily a deal breaker. The federal FOIA in most states, if you substantially prevail, will pay some or all of your fees. There are legal clinics that will help you if your case is righteous. So look out for them. Miranda has a great list of them in her book. And then finally, most lawyers are required to do pro bono work. So at the National Security Archive, we would go to law firms and say, this is a FOIA case. You can get to argue in front of a judge to get these records out that are important, and the lawyers would gobble them up. So that often is the best way to get sensitive records, is to have a judge, or records in a timely manner, have a judge do the work of the agency for them and say, essentially, you shall release these records by this date, is the benefit to going to court.
We have some questions in the Q&A. One of them is, I think someone's searching for information on MuckRock. So Mike, I'm going to ask you this directly. There's a question about whether or not MuckRock helps with litigating any of the info that it gets, or if not, do you provide resources for folks who are interested in pursuing that route?
Yeah. Nobody on staff is a lawyer, least of all me. I'm the most unlawyer-like person on staff, so we cannot help with litigation. We might be able to make some recommendations of people to reach out to, depending on the case, but we are actually going to be working on a major effort over the next year to kind of help better connect people with lawyers as well as other legal resources. So I'm excited to have a better answer a year from now when we have this conversation. But we also have a really wonderful community, whether or not you file through MuckRock, at muckrock.com/Slack. You can kind of join our real-time Slack where people workshop requests or kind of do peer-to-peer support. And we have a few other resources that might be useful.
I'm going to ask one last question from the chat before using moderator's prerogative to close with my final question. This one is also from Alex, and I think Alex Howard, and I think the gist of it is what to do with the fact that the Justice Department, specifically the Office of Information Policy, has not been seen by many as being an honest broker. What can we do as members of the FOIA community who both advocate for better solutions but file FOIA requests? What can we do about the fact that the Justice Department in many ways has not been an advocate for us, and in many instances defends agency bad decisions in court? Do we have any options there? Nate, I see you nodding your head, so maybe we can start with you.
I mean, that's been the case, in my opinion, as long as I've been doing FOIAs for pushing 20 years. And my colleagues that have been doing it for longer than me, I think, would say the same thing. So the silver lining is that although there is an actor in the federal government that is not on the requester side, and that is on the, in my opinion, the agency's withholding side, we can still get a lot of records out anyways. I think the best offense against that, again, is the courts. Essentially forcing the agencies to do their job under FOIA, even though DOJ is arguing that they shouldn't have to. And again, the courts are overruling DOJ and forcing the release of records. So to find ways to make that affordable, get maybe stronger rulings, get maybe pattern and practice rulings, but the satisfying or unsatisfying answer is that is that there is one branch of the government that is willing to force the executive branch to follow the law of the FOIA often.
Great point. So with that, I have my final question, which I think will appeal to the journalists and all of you. But I'm wondering if each of you could talk about any outstanding FOIA requests that you've got out now with a local or federal agency, and what story you're hoping to tell with the documents when they get released. In other words, what are the documents you most want to see at this point in time, and what are the stories you're most hopeful you can tell? Miranda, could I start with you by any chance?
Yeah, interestingly enough, in this case in Alabama that I wrote about, this community that needed a new sewer system, it was mostly financed by the US Department of Agriculture, not EPA, which should tell you something, which is that, USDA works for agriculture and agribusiness too, not just small farms. And EPA, at least in the old days, who knows what today will bring, but, was more focused on environmental issues. So there are still issues outstanding. I mean, I've had FOIA requests pending with USDA for more than a couple of years, never mind the 20-day rule for some kind of response. And, we're still getting documents sort of, a colleague and I are getting documents kind of piecemeal from them. And, the big question there was, why were these certain decisions made that do not appear from the community standpoint to benefit the community at all? And, I don't really have an answer to that yet. I don't know that the documents will necessarily reveal it, although piecemeal, we've gotten little hints that, there were questions raised and people wondering. But, it's sort of mundane. I mean, these are the kind of bread and butter issues that I've been writing about for years, which is, sewers, drinking water, things that affect people's daily lives. But that's the answer.
Mike or Nate, do either of you have examples you'd like to talk about?
Sure. So the JFK assassination records have now largely, not 100% completely, but pretty dang close, been released. And side note, that shows that information that is technically classified, that would be withheld under FOIA, can be released with no harm whatsoever and great benefit. So tell that to your Congress people and FOI advocates. It's a good win. But in that release, there was a list of records that the church committee, that the CIA wrote to the church committee saying, these are the internal CIA histories that the committee that oversees us in our bad actions probably will want to know about. So almost showing their hand. And that record was in the JFK files. I'd like to get my hands on all of those histories and see what they say.
Very cool. Mike, how about you?
That's a tough act to follow, but we've got two projects going on right now that we are filing requests on, but also inviting people to kind of help us file requests on. The first is police decertification data. So if a cop does something bad, they can, in some states, get their certification to be a cop revoked. Usually what happens after that is they move to another state and are a cop there until they get kicked out of that state. And hopefully they have a good real estate agent. But if we're trying to get data for all 50 states, eventually, right now we're focused on a few states. So if you're interested in that, join us. We'd love to kind of help kind of going through that data, requesting that information. And it's, I think, real public benefit. And then we also recently merged with another group called the Data Liberation Project that, looks for interesting data sets that the government might have. And then we file FOIA requests for them. And sometimes we sue, sometimes we spend a lot of time like digging into that data, trying to clean it up and explain it. So if you're interested in FOIA, please join us and we can get some good transparency.
That's all fascinating. And I see that we are just at the hour. So I will take this opportunity to thank all the panelists. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Nate, for joining us. Thank you to the audience for joining us. If you can find Nate Jones's writing at the Washington Post, including his column, which he mentioned, Revealing the Records, and his book, Able Archer 83, The Secret History of the NATO War Scare That Almost Triggered Nuclear War. You can follow Miranda's work on her website, mirandaspivack.com, and her book is out now, Backroom Deals in Our Backyards, How Government Secrecy Harms Our Communities and the Local Heroes Fighting Back. And you can keep up with Michael Morisy and MuckRock at muckrock.com, and you can subscribe to their newsletters at muckrock.com/newsletters. If you'd like to learn more about FPF and other press freedom issues, including the FOIA work that we're doing, sign up for our newsletters at freedom.press/newsletters or visit freedom.press at the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker at pressfreedomtracker.us. To continue advocating for these journalists you see here and those across the country, we need your help. You can also support our work at freedom.press/donate. Thank you, everybody, so much for your time. It was a pleasure seeing you all, personal and professional. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much.
Bye.